So every time I get to make a video like this, specifically with these type of devices, it always makes my heart just throb out of my chest, and you guys can probably feel it and hear it over the microphone. Now, what I'm specifically talking about, and it's not just iPhones, it's not just big phones or anything like that. This phone was one of the first iPhones that I ever used, and it was actually the first iPhone that I actually used as a main iPhone. The iPhone 6 Plus, which came out in 2014, which will be turning 7 years old this year, is one of the, only iPhones that I used at a certain point. I did have an iPhone that I was using as like an iPod, but this was the first iPhone that I put my SIM card in and I used it. And I can definitely tell you, I had a really good experience with it at that time. I think this was in 2016. If you look back at some of my videos in 2016, you can see my transition from the, LG G2 to the 6 Plus. And overall, I can definitely tell you my experience with the 6 Plus was so good that I was always wondering, what can I do to basically, go to the next phone? Like, how can I justify that purchase? Nowadays, the iPhone 6 Plus, I don't think I could use it comfortably. I could use it by all means, and I think I would probably have an okay experience, but it would definitely not be something that I would look forward to, like how I look forward to using my iPhone 12 Pro sometimes. But the 6 Plus, at a certain point, was Apple's flagship device, and the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus combined were Apple's best-selling phones ever, I think. It might have been, replaced with another phone since then. But this is definitely one of my favorite iPhones for sure, in a different sense. It's one of my favorite because of what it meant to me personally, but I don't think it was like the most impactful. I don't think it has the biggest history, but this iPhone is definitely super interesting. It has that 5.5 inch IPS panel on the front, and I'll definitely tell you, not a bad panel at all. It still isn't that bad. I mean, Apple released the iPhone SE 2 with kind of the same looking panel with the home button and stuff, and I honestly don't have a problem with it. Of course, if Apple, if this was their flagship phone right now in 2021, that'd be a whole different story. But the fact that this phone, was, a 2014 phone is totally understandable. A lot of the market still had a lot of bezel, so totally understandable for the most part. You have the home button with Touch ID, which is cool, and I wish Apple brings Touch ID back sooner than later, with a lightning port and headphone jack on the bottom, and the lightning port is still being used on all the iPhones, so nothing has really changed there. And on the back, we have the aluminum back, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, Apple made these phones so future-proof when it comes down to just the way they feel in the hand. This phone still feels like a very premium phone. It does not feel cheap at all. Yeah, it kind of looks a little bit different just because it's an older device, but as I said before, this is a humongous asset. The way this phone feels is a humongous thing for sure when it comes down to it. Now, on the back of the iPhone 6 Plus, you do have that single camera setup, which I'll go and hit on right now. It is that single 8 megapixel sensor, and you have optical image stabilization on it. You have some capability when it comes down to just the way this camera holds up in comparison, to nowadays. But honestly, I think everyone knows this, it's not the best camera anymore. But at that time, it was still pretty decent. You did have, some capability. You had 1080p at 60. You had video and audio and all that stuff that you can record just like in many other phones in 2014. Now, compared to nowadays, obviously it's not the best. You don't have a crazy amount of capability, no portrait mode, no night mode, no nothing like that. But if you know how to edit your photos and videos a little bit, I think you could still get some pretty decent looking photos and videos from this thing. I think the biggest problem is probably the front camera, as I stated. With the back cameras, like, it's totally okay. If you don't have that great of a camera, you can edit it up and change things up and everything. But something with the front cameras, this thing only having a 1.2 megapixel sensor is definitely not something that I'm looking forward to with using. Only 720p as well. So it just kind of keeps getting worse and worse in a case like this. So in my opinion, the cameras aren't that great. It is kind of a problem when it comes down to it. Again, Apple kind of fixed it up a little bit with the 4K on the iPhone 6 Plus, or the 6S Plus for that matter. But I'll definitely tell you, for 2014, it is kind of understandable for the most part. So I'll give them some slack. So as of right now, this camera isn't that great, but at that time, maybe it was okay. And I remember in 2016, when I was using this phone, I wasn't really complaining about the camera that much. I was complaining about some other areas, but I wasn't really complaining. Actually, I don't know those many areas I was complaining about this phone, and to be completely honest, at that time. So in terms of the camera, that pretty much covers it up. Now, software-wise, this is by far, I think, the biggest asset of this device. It originally came out with iOS 8. It did stop getting updates at iOS 12. So you might be wondering, wait, look, why are you talking about like that being an asset? It's already outdated. Well, it is outdated in terms of the full OS updates, but this thing actually ended up still getting updates to this day. Well, until like 2020, like in December. but this phone was still getting updates up until like December or November of 2020. How crazy is that? This phone is already unsupported, but it's still getting some sort of software updates, which is insane. So that in and of itself is another huge W for the iPhone 6 Plus, and that just adds so much more character to this type of device. As I said before, and I'll say it again a million times, having a phone like this with this type of software experience is super amazing, and it just makes me so excited to, recommend phones like the iPhone 12s and the iPhone 13s and all these phones, because they're just going to last for a super long time. Right now, obviously, the iPhone 6 Plus, I would not necessarily recommend it anymore, but at the time, it was a super valuable phone, and even now, it's still like okay, it's still getting software updates, and it has that checkra jailbreak, which is really, really cool. So, in terms of the software in the iPhone 6 Plus, that pretty much covers it up. Now, performance-wise, this thing has the Apple A8 chip inside of it, a dual-core CPU, and a 1 GB of RAM on every single model that this phone came out with. And what I'll tell you is basically this, okay? First of all, I just want to get out of the way. This phone's performance isn't that great anymore. It's not a fast phone. It's an okay performing phone at best. It's definitely not something I would go and recommend people to use. If you have a choice, I wouldn't recommend people to go and pick up an iPhone 6 Plus because the performance is so good. Phones like the iPhone 8, the iPhone 10, those are I think the type of phones that I would kind of say in that sense for the value per dollar. The 6 Plus is not one of those phones. It is a pretty slow phone when it comes down to it. There's not a lot of fluidity, but there is smoothness. I'll give it that. There's still quite a bit of smoothness when you consider the fact that this is a 7-year-old phone. I remember last year, a couple years before, I was looking at these older phones, like some Galaxy phones of 2014 and some other devices too. They don't really, they're not that smooth anymore. So that's something that Apple has gotten down so well that you can just go use a phone like this and just forget about the rest. You don't have to worry about the smoothness. Like I said before, there are other aspects of this type of device that aren't necessarily the best. There are areas, such as the performance in some cases, the app opening speeds, the gameplay and all that stuff. But when you have a device like this with this type of smoothness, I'll definitely give it the benefit of the doubt in that sense. But for every other purpose, for the most part, it's definitely not the fastest or smoothest thing, but it definitely is okay smooth for when it comes down to the year that it came out with. So in terms of that really pretty much covers it up. Now ending it off with the battery life, this device does have that 2,915 mAh battery, and as I said before, this is still one of the biggest assets for this phone. Surprisingly, the battery life at that time was great because it was the biggest battery at that time. But even now, this battery size for when it was released is bigger than the iPhone 12, the 12 mini, and the 12 Pro, which is crazy to me. How is that even possible? It's just so insane. I don't know why Apple does this. Now, unfortunately, the battery life has degraded, so it's not at that full 2,915 mAh anymore. But I'll still say for the most part, it's totally okay. And it does have a lot of capability because you can go ahead and, remove it and replace it if you want to. So that's another pretty big thing about this phone too. So in terms of the overall battery life, that pretty much covers it up. And to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, is the iPhone 6 Plus still worth it in 2021? Well, what I'll tell you is like this, okay? I'll have a couple of pros, a couple of cons, and I'll just break it down. The iPhone 6 Plus, I think the panel of it is still actually pretty good. And I'll definitely say the panel of it isn't bad. You have that 5.5 inch panel, like I stated, which is still pretty good, high resolution than the iPhone SE2 that came out in 2020. So I think this specific device has a pretty good panel for the most part. Definitely not perfect, but it's okay for a 7-year-old phone. You have Touch ID, which may be important to some people. Still have that lightning port and headphone jack, which is cool. So for anybody who wants to use that, that's cool. You have that type of capability. As I said before, this thing feels extremely premium. It does not feel like a cheap phone, and that's a huge thing. When you have a device like this, you don't want it to feel extremely cheap. You don't want it to feel, unnecessary or, oh my God, a plastic back or whatever. You're not going to feel like that when you have a device like this. The back camera is totally okay. I think that's the best way I can put it. It's really not that great. It's very, very middle of the road for a 7-year-old device, but still, it's okay. It still turns on. You have that checkra jailbreak, which is huge. You were getting software updates for quite a bit of time too on a device like this, which is another huge asset. But there definitely are some type of problems with this type of device. You are getting, you're not getting IP certification, which I think is a pretty big deal nowadays. You want some durability on your phone, and you're not really going to be getting the most durable phone in a device like this. So that's a pretty big thing to keep in mind. The performance is not that great. Like I said, it's kind of smooth, but it's definitely not fast, and it's not something I would recommend people to go and actively buy just because of the performance. The battery life isn't, the best thing ever. It's totally okay, and I actually think it may be a pro for this phone, but it's definitely not something I would go and brag about. The software updates, this thing is not getting software updates anymore, so that's another pretty big disadvantage for it too. And I'll definitely say if you have no other option, that getting a phone like this I think is totally fine for the most part. Like this is not a bad phone for a 2014 device, but it's not like a great phone. It's not a good phone nowadays. A phone that I would recommend that's actually good is like an iPhone 7 Plus. Like that's like a pretty good phone for still, for nowadays. But the 6 Plus is not like a good phone. It's like if you have to use it, then go for it if you have no other choice. But phones like a 7 Plus and iPhone 6S Plus even is a pretty big upgrade. That phone is still getting software support, and it's not really outdated until it's not getting software support anymore. So that's even going from a 6 Plus to a 6S Plus, in my opinion, is a pretty big upgrade. So I'll go ahead and link a couple of phones that I can think of that might be worthwhile upgrades from this device, and you can check them out in the description below. Like I stated before, you can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. But that's really pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section as well. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count. So it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.